Okay, so we are here in sunny Kiev. It is the 11th of May, and I'm with Father Cyril Havarun to discuss Ukrainian Church of Otosopoli and its prospects in Ukraine. So, Father Cyril, let's start with the first question. Can you please explain for our readers why Ukraine has the church structure that it has? What churches exist? Right. Which churches come into play with the Otosopoli question?
Well, the Ukrainian structure of the churches is peculiar. It's rather unusual. In most Orthodox countries, there is one single church, and the idea of one church for one nation reflects somehow the Orthodox ecclesiology. The Orthodox ecclesiology as it developed in the past, in the Middle Ages particularly, and I would say it is normative in the Orthodox countries. In this sense, Ukraine is not normative. It doesn't mean that it is not normal, though. The Ukrainian situation is that there are several Orthodox churches in this country. One of them is recognized, is so-called canonical church. Canonical means legitimate, the one which is recognized as a church
by whom
other,
is it?
Yes, by other churches which recognize one another.
Orthodox churches.
Orthodox churches
and Catholic churches.
Well, actually, it doesn't matter whether the Catholic Church recognizes. It's good when the Catholic Church recognizes such a church, but it doesn't matter if it does for the Orthodox churches, because we are still not in communion with the Catholic Church. We try to get closer to this communion, but we are still not there. And recognition means communion. When my church recognizes another church, it implies that my church is in communion with the other church.
So how many churches are we talking about?
Yes, we are talking about 15 churches, Orthodox churches worldwide.
With a patriarch, yes?
Some of them are patriarchates, some of them are not patriarchates, but they are autocephalous churches. And in this sense, autocephaly is a normal status for any Orthodox church. That is the only form in which a church unit exists. That is the historical form of organization of the church, of the church structure. It's one of the most ancient and most popular form of church's organization.
What does it mean?
It means that the Orthodox churches they don't have a pyramidal structure as the Catholic Church has. The Orthodox Church doesn't have a pope. Well, we have actually a pope in Alexandria, but he's one of the patriarchs. And we are talking about the fellowship or commonwealth of Orthodox churches. It is very similar to the British Commonwealth in a sense, in the same sense as the independent nations constitute a fellowship of nations that identify themselves with the British Commonwealth. In the same sense, the churches that are autocephalous, that belong to this fellowship of the Orthodox churches, they are independent from one another, but at the same time they are in a close relationship to one another. Particularly, they are in Eucharistic communion with one another. It means that I, as a member, for instance, of the Russian Church, may go to the Bulgarian Church and take communion there. That is a direct implication for me as an ordinary member of my church, that my church has communion with the other and recognizes that other church. In application to Ukraine, it means that only one church is in communion with the rest of the Orthodox churches. That is the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, the so-called Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And it means that the members of this church may go, say, to Cyprus or to Greece and to partake in Eucharist there. Other two churches are not recognized, meaning that their members normally would not be allowed to take communion in the churches worldwide, in the recognized canonical churches worldwide.
But they do. Anyway.
Sometimes they do, if they are not asked to. But if they ask which church they belongs to, and they answer that they belong to the Patriarchate of Kiev, normally it would mean that the priest would not be able to give communion to that person. And that is the consequence exactly of this non-recognized status of the churches they belong to in Ukraine. And those churches are two. The largest one is the Patriarchate of Kiev, the so-called Patriarchate of Kiev, and the other one is the Ukrainian Orthodox Autocephalous Church. Those two churches are self-proclaimed. They are not recognized. They are non-canonical. Those are words which normally describe those churches. As I said, it's not so much maybe important whether those churches are canonical or not per se, as it is important as the implications of the status of the church for the faithful who belong to those churches are important. That those members, they feel themselves and they understand themselves, and they are told that they are kind of secondary class members of the Orthodox community. They are not allowed to take communion in other churches. They cannot be fully received even if they go to pilgrimages, for instance, to the Holy Land, or I don't know, to Mount Athos, to the places of pilgrimage. If people there know that they belong to the Patriarchate of Kiev, they would treat those people, those pilgrims, as second-class Orthodox Christians. They would probably not give, and most probably would not be giving them a communion. They would not be giving them treatment as other Christians, say, from Ukraine would receive.
So, why did these churches form in the first place? UCKP and UAPC.
Yes. Well, they emerged in Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the independence of the Ukrainian state. I said re-emerged in the sense that they did not emerge from scratch, as it were. There were precedents in the beginning of the 20th century. The moment when the independent Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian People's Republic, was established, at the same time the independent Ukrainian Church was attempted to be established as well. Again, rather unsuccessfully, because there was a huge pressure from Russia, and eventually, after the Soviet Russia occupied Ukraine, they quenched any attempt to have an independent Ukrainian state. And since then, it has been a kind of rule for the Russian state to prevent any attempt of independence of the Ukrainian Church, because this would secure the common political space where Ukraine would be included. For the Imperial Russia, it was important to keep the Ukrainian Church under its umbrella in order to preserve the integrity of Ukraine in the Russian Empire. In the Soviet times, when the Soviet Union effectively, it destroyed the Russian Empire. Its purpose was to destroy the empire. It was an anti-imperial kind of state, the anti-imperial ideology that was used by the Soviets. Still, the Ukrainian Church was not allowed to exist in the Soviet Union. With the new independence of Ukraine in the end of the 20th century, there was an attempt to re-establish an independent Ukrainian Church. Again, the Russian Church and the Russian state opposed those attempts, as they did oppose those attempts in the beginning of the 20th century, and did everything possible to prevent establishing an autocephalous Ukrainian Church. So the non-canonical, unrecognized status of the two churches, Ukrainian churches, which are autocephalous, which claim to be autocephalous, owes to a great extent to the efforts of the Russian Federation to prevent this recognition. And what we experience nowadays is very similar to that. That we observe that with the new initiative to give proper recognition to the autocephalous church in Ukraine, we observe how increased the effort of Russian politicians, not necessarily only the church, but also the Russian diplomacy and the state machinery to prevent this from happening. This allows many people in Ukraine to interpret the idea of autocephaly, which is a churchly kind of phenomenon. Autocephaly is a very old institution, and as I said, it's the basic form of organization of the Orthodox Church. In Ukraine, this institution sometimes is interpreted as an instrument of colonization or decolonization, even though this institute appeared and was adopted by the church before any colonial kind of idea, any colonial period. It is interpreted in the terms of colonialism and as a struggle against colonialism.
Mm-hmm. But you mentioned right now that Russia did not want Ukraine to establish this church, to not create its own political space. But right now in Ukraine, we have a secular state. The state is separated from the church. So how can we talk about a political state? Can you please comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. So, well, Ukraine is certainly is not a religious state. According to its constitution, it's not a theocracy. It's not. It doesn't have an established church in the same sense as, for instance, even some European countries have, like Germany or Finland, for instance. At the same time, the Ukrainian society is ultimately religious. It's very religious. It's more religious than most European countries. Its religiosity can be compared to the Polish society in some sense. Maybe Polish society is even more religious. But I mean, in the political discourse, in the social discourse, religion still plays a very important role in Ukraine. And we saw how this religious discourse played a significant role during the Revolution of Dignity, during the Maidan events. The Maidan was a political phenomenon. It was a political manifestation, protestation of the people who wanted political change. At the same time, the way how the demands of the people were expressed in Ukraine at the Maidan was not secular, it was religious. So people articulated their political and social concerns through religious symbols, and they participated in prayer. There was everyday prayer on the Maidan. A lot of priests, bishops ascended to the scene of the Maidan and addressed people. So the Maidan was a religious phenomenon in some sense, and this exactly indicated the priorities and the ways how Ukrainian people express themselves. Even if Ukrainians don't go necessarily to the church regularly, they still understand themselves in religious terms often. Well, we can call it cultural Christianity. It is called a cultural Christianity or an identity, but on the level of identity and cultural associations, identification, religion is very important for the Ukrainian people. That's why the idea of autocephaly stirs so much controversy and interest in the Ukrainian society. Besides that, the Russian aggression against Ukraine also was expressed, articulated, and moved by religiously charged rhetoric. The entire ideology of the Russian world is religious as such. It's not a secular ideology. It's not a secular phenomenon. It is religious. It is religious rhetoric. It rides on the idea of counterposition between the East and the West, between the presumably holy or religious, spiritual East and godless West. It renders the conflict in Ukraine in the terms of counterposition between the Orthodox civilization and non-Orthodox civilization, like Catholic or Protestant or atheist civilizations. These rhetorics have been constructed by the church within the church, and it means that the aggression against Ukraine has a religious dimension, just as the Maidan had a religious dimension, even though it was a political and social phenomenon. They are just the opposite sides, as it were, of of two interpretations of religion, very different interpretations of religion. I think the interpretation of the Maidan was non-violent. Interpretation of religion as a very constructive force, as a force that can help building civil society, and the Russian aggression through the Russian world is another interpretation of religion as a force that rebukes something like democratic and social civic values, as it were. So, given that the rhetoric of the Russian world is religiously charged, that the Russian aggression features a very strong religious dimension. Many people who come to the east of Ukraine to fight on the Russian side, they are motivated religiously. The status of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy is not anymore just a business for the churches. It's now a political issue. It's a security issue, if you want. And to a great extent, it's a precondition of survival of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian society. So, hence is the concern. Hence are the concerns of the Ukrainian state and of the Ukrainian society regarding the status of the Ukrainian church, because this status, the issue of autocephaly, as I said, it is used, it has been used since at least the collapse of the Russian Empire by Moscow as an instrument of colonization of Ukraine. In the same sense, the issue of autocephaly for the Ukrainian state is a chance for decolonization of Ukraine.
So how would this autocephaly look like if it were proclaimed? I mean, so President Poroshenko, he sent an appeal, the other Ukrainian presidents also signed this appeal. So who would get this autocephaly in Ukraine? What would happen afterwards?
Right. Well, sometimes this initiative is presented as political, and it looks like, if one looks at it superficially. But what Poroshenko did, he just articulated the concerns of many Ukrainian Christians, Orthodox Christians. He himself is actually a faithful member of the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, by the way. And many people who help him to promote this idea in the Ukrainian political establishment also associate themselves with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And they represent, in some sense, many Ukrainian Orthodox who disagree with the policies and rhetoric of the Russian Church, and who don't have an alternative where to go, to any canonical church where to go. The only option that they have where to go, where to take communion, is the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, which is completely coherent with the rhetoric and politics of the Moscow Patriarchate, and this creates a very severe dilemma for their consciousness. On the one hand, they want to go to a canonical church, to be in communion with the rest of the Orthodox Christians worldwide, and the only outlet, as it were, for this communion is the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And at the same time, they disagree with the rhetoric, with the public statements, and sometimes absence of statements, just silence, which sometimes is more telling than statements, of the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, and they don't want to go to the church, and they don't have an alternative.
Silence on what issues?
Like on war, for instance. While other Ukrainian churches are outspoken about war and aggression, the Ukrainian Church of Moscow Patriarchate has never condemned the war. It has never even named the war by its proper name as war. And this creates a lot of obstacles for the conscience of people who go to that church.
Oh, yes.
And that is a major concern for many, including, people in the political establishment who go to the church.
Mm-hmm.
I think I cannot read thoughts and feelings of people, but I assume that even Poroshenko himself, as a personality, as a Christian, has difficulties to of this sort. So what they do is they try to give a chance to those people to face this sort of dilemmas, moral dilemmas, this sort of difficulties for their consciousness, to go to a canonical church, a recognized church, to the church in communion with other churches, and to feel relieved, to feel that they do not subscribe to the Russian aggression and Russian rhetoric, Russian propaganda, just by the fact that they go to the church. I interpret this initiative not just as a political initiative, even though yes, there is a political dimension. We can talk about this because this may contribute to the victory of Poroshenko for the second term, certainly if he succeeds. But most important is that the state essentially secures or helps its citizens to improve the quality of their life, including their spiritual life. It should be done by the churches. I agree. It is a business of the churches to relieve people from this burden of political agendas when they come to the church. But unfortunately, the churches themselves, they don't contribute to that very much. And I mean primarily the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. It doesn't help people to feel relieved from propaganda and this rhetoric. And in this situation, when the churches don't do what they are expected to do, then the politicians interfere. Maybe it's not the perfect scenario, of course, of solving this problem, but it is the only possible scenario at this moment. And again, it is not the initiative of Poroshenko or any other politician in Ukraine. They just help, they just articulate, they just translate, as it were, the desires, the expectations of people, faithful, their citizens, and try to facilitate them to get what they want to get. Recognition, ecclesial recognition by the worldwide orthodoxy, free, liberated from the Russian imperial or neo-imperial rhetoric and activities.
Okay, but when this autocephaly, let's assume it's granted, so the scenario that's being discussed is that UACKP gets the autocephaly and everybody else sort of groups around them.
Yes, it's going to be, it's still not 100% clear what will be the structure which will be given autocephaly. What I can say, which is more or less sure, is is going to be a new structure. It's going to be autocephaly will be given not to any existing church, but a new structure will be established, will be created from the existing elements, so that people, communities primarily, but also diocesan structures of the existing churches will be included to this new church, and autocephaly will be given to this new structure. We can assume that the majority of the dioceses and communities that will enter the structure will now belong to the Patriarchate of Kiev. But it is also expected that many, difficult to say how many, but many communities and even dioceses from the Moscow Patriarchate will join the structure, as well as the third, this minor, tiny Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church will join the structure as well. There are also expectations that some communities from the Greek Catholic Church may join this structure eventually, because so far in the situation of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, to my knowledge, many members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate have left this church and joined the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, because for them it is the only recognized legitimate alternative.
Like Chernomorets,
for instance, yes. Well, there are quite a few of them, and they may come back to this newly established church. So the procedure will be as follows. I think it will ride on the precedent that existed in 1924, which was created in 1924, when a part of the Russian Church at the time, after the collapse of the Russian Empire, which was in Poland, was granted autocephaly by the Patriarchate of Constantinople in 1924. It was done in a unilateral way, so the Patriarchate of Constantinople just unilaterally, without consultations with other churches, granted autocephaly to this church, claiming or referring to the fact that before the end of the 17th century, that church belonged to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. The Church of Kiev was established in the 10th century as a metropolis, as metropolia of the Church of Constantinople, and it existed as such until the end of the 17th century. So we can say that the Ukrainian Church, well, even though it was not called at that time Ukrainian Church, but the Church of Kiev, for most of its history existed under the umbrella of the Patriarchate of Constantinople as a part of that. And essentially, in the end of the 17th century, the Patriarchate of Constantinople transferred its part, the Church of Kiev, to the Church of Moscow, not to be integrated to the Church of Moscow, but to be managed by the Church of Moscow. So it claimed its rights on the Church of Kiev, even when that Church of Kiev was managed by the Church of Moscow.
Why was it managed?
Well, there was no other option at that time.
Part-timers, right?
Yes, it was a sort of, well, a similar situation nowadays we can observe in Greece, where some dioceses of the autocephalous Greek Church effectively are a part of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and were given to Athens, to the Autocephalous Church of Greece, to be managed by the Church, but they belong still to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, and they are obliged to commemorate the Patriarch of Constantinople. Mm-hmm. So one of the conditions of passing the Ukrainian Church to Moscow was that that church should commemorate the Patriarch of Constantinople, which was abolished, this condition, very soon after this transaction. Because of the violations of the conditions of passing this Patriarchate of this metropolis of Kiev to Moscow, which happened soon after this passage, this transaction happened, the Patriarchate of Constantinople in the 20th century claimed its rights for that church back. And that was the rationale of the Thomas for autocephaly of the Polish Church in 1924. And I assume that the same rationale will be invoked in the Thomas tome granted by the Patriarchate of Constantinople to Ukraine again. So it will be a decision of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, rather unilateral decision, I assume, regarding a church which used to be a part of this church for many centuries, actually for most of its history, which was given to the Patriarchate of Moscow, to the Church of Moscow, under its management, but not as its integral part. And the Patriarchate of Constantinople will effectively claim its rights over the church back, reclaim those rights. That is the scheme. And this church institutionally will be reorganized as it were, or re-established from the parts which exist nowadays, from the existing parts, from all three parts, and parts of the Greek Catholic Church may join this church as well.
So, is this a new idea, this church autocephaly for Ukraine? Has it been attempted before?
Yeah. Well, when the Church of Kiev was established in the 10th century, it became an integral part of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and it existed as such for a long time. There was a division within the Church of Kiev. One part of this church went to the northeastern part of what at the time was the Kievan state, and became the Church of Moscow.
After the Tatar-Mongol invasion.
Yes, it was exactly after the Tatar War. It's maybe difficult to comprehend for the readers, but after the 13th century. The Kievan state was almost destroyed, and its heritage was divided between two emerging principalities at the time: the Principality of Moscow and the Principality of Lithuania and Poland. So a part of the Kievan Church moved to northwest, to what is now Moscow, and it moved there as a Kievan Church, as the Church of Kiev, and an integral part of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And that part of the Ecumenical Patriarchate proclaimed unilaterally, without consultations with the Mother Church, its autocephaly, which was illegal and remained illegal for almost 150 years. So at that time the Church of Russia, Moscow, was schismatic, was non-canonical, was not in communion with other churches. And another part of the church remained faithful to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and in its center moved to the territories of the Polish-Lithuanian state, and remained faithful to the Ecumenical Patriarchate until the 17th century.
Wait, but that means that the Kiev Church actually was schismatic, because it moved.
No.
So the Kiev Church divided into the.
No, one part of the Kievan Church, one part of the Kievan Church, which moved to Moscow.
Yes.
I interpret those parts as two clones.
Right.
In some sense, of the Kievan Church, moved to Moscow, proclaimed its own autocephaly, which was illegal, non-canonical.
So it was us, anyway.
No,
it wasn't the Moscow.
It was them.
Yeah, but we moved there.
No. Who are we?
Like we.
No. So that part of the Kievan Church moved to Moscow, proclaimed its own autocephaly, and remained uncanonical for 150 years.
Yes, but it was the Kievan Church.
The other church, Kievan Church as well, had its centers in Kiev, in Novogrudok, for instance, in Vilnius, in other parts of the Kievan, of the Polish-Lithuanian state.
Right.
And that church, which geographically covered also Kiev, what is now Kiev, remained under the Ecumenical Patriarchate until the end of the 17th century. And then it was given to Moscow. By that time, Moscow had been recognized already by the rest of the churches. It took a long time, but with the effort of the Russian Tsars, that schismatic part of the church was recognized. So, to that part, the church in Kiev, which remained faithful to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, was given by the Ecumenical Patriarchate to be managed by Moscow, but to remain an integral part of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And now Constantinople claims back this part of the Kievan Church for itself from Moscow.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to understand is that basically this Moscow church that proclaimed autocephaly, it was in schismatic for 150 years.
Yes, and
the Kiev Church, we contributed to the establishment of this church that was
correct.
Schismatic.
Yes, because originally
it was our fault too.
In some sense it was, yes, but again, if we talk about those people who live in Kiev, people who lived in Kiev remained faithful to the Ecumenical Patriarchate at the time. Some people who moved from Kiev to Moscow, including, for instance, Metropolitan Petrov from Volhynia, who became Metropolitan of Moscow, those people yielded to the demands of the Moscow rulers, who wanted their own autocephalous church.
I see. Yeah, why I'm asking this is because we have this tendency in Ukraine to say they in Russia they're bad, but we are always good, and they
no, we were not always good. No, it's
it's just interesting to know that that's like we had a large part to play in the establishment of the Moscow and the Russian Church anyway.
Yes, some Kievans contributed to establishing the Muscovite state, of course, and to the autocephaly, uncanonical at the time, autocephaly of the Russian Church. Well, I see another irony in this, that the church that used to be uncanonical itself for a long time, which separated from the canonical church, now accuses its kind of sister or brother,
system.
yes, in doing the same. And this is a kind of historical irony. In relationship to the Tomos, it is important to understand that for Constantinople, it's not a creation of a new thing. It's about claiming back its own rights. But Constantinople is ready to give autocephaly to this church, which will be a new thing. Originally, 10 years ago, and it's coming back to your question about the history of the autocephalous movement. Yes. So 10 years ago, in 2028, under President Yushchenko, there was another attempt to establish an autocephalous church in Ukraine. At that time, though, Constantinople wanted to establish first its own outpost, its own metropolis, under its own jurisdiction, not
2008, right?
2008, yes, not an independent church, but a church under the jurisdiction of Constantinople at the time. So Yushchenko, there was a clash between two models: the model promoted by Yushchenko and the model promoted by Constantinople, and that was one of the reasons why it didn't happen. The initiative of Yushchenko failed at the time, because Constantinople had a different vision about this church. It wanted this church back to its kind of to its jurisdiction. And nowadays, Constantinople, it seems, agreed to grant complete independence to this new church. And again, this story did not begin in 2008. It began in the beginning of the 20th century, when in
19th century,
20th century, no,
20th
century, yes.
Okay.
But as a more kind of general phenomenon, it began in the 19th century. In the 19th century, what happened? In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire, which included vast Orthodox populations, they still constituted minorities in those empires, in the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman empires, right? And they had a struggle for their independence. It was a national awakening, the spring of nations and so forth, the national and nationalistic sometimes revolutions, and guerrilla wars against the imperial centers. And exactly in that time, autocephaly became a big issue for those empires, because autocephaly became a vehicle of national independence for those states, for those nations. The Orthodox nations, though they included Greeks within the Ottoman Empire, they included Bulgarians, Serbs, Romanians, Montenegrins, Macedonians, and so forth. So those Balkan nations, they wanted independence for themselves from the imperial centers, and autocephaly for them became an instrument of departing from empires. In the beginning of the 20th century, the same movement continued regarding the Russian Empire. After the collapse of the Russian Empire, the Orthodox nations that felt that they are not Russians, they wanted their own national identity, claimed their own national identity, continuing the tendencies in the Balkans in the 19th century, continue the same anti-imperial kind of trend. They claimed autocephaly for themselves. Some of those claims succeeded and some failed. Like, for instance, what succeeded was the claim, for instance, of the Polish Church. The Polish Church, the Polish state was established in the beginning of the 20th century after the collapse of the Russian Empire, and they managed to get their own independence in 1924. Also, the Finnish Church succeeded. It was an intrinsic part of the Russian Church, and it managed to not to get independence, complete independence. They were satisfied with the autonomous status within the Church of Constantinople, and was granted this status by the Church of Constantinople, and it was a way of departure from the empire. The same was later on with the Church of Czechoslovakia. Ukraine also was engaged in this national struggle in the beginning of the 20th century, but again, because the Ukrainian state failed, it could not enforce the autocephalous course to succeed eventually. There was an attempt, and especially, well, as probably some will know, the Ukrainian state at that time had two faces: the face of the People's Republic and the face of Directoria, which was more like kind of more monarchical rule under the hetman. And at the early phase of the Ukrainian People's Republic, the state did not very much interfere to the church matters. There was a popular movement within the Ukrainian church among the Orthodox Ukrainians to have their own independent church, but it was not enforced by the state. But under Hetman Skoropadsky, this course was enforced, and there were some laws adopted by the Ukrainian state to recognize and to help establishing this independent Ukrainian church. And again, because the Ukrainian independence movement was quenched, was abolished by the Soviet Russia, this applied to the independent Ukrainian church as well, until the new Ukrainian state re-emerged, and together with the state, the expectations for the independent church re-emerged as well.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, like today, church autocephaly for Ukraine is not only a Ukrainian issue. We see a big resistance from Moscow. So what's in Ukrainian church autocephaly for Russia?
Right. Well, it's quite obvious that in the situation of war, of the Russian aggression, the Russian influence, political influence upon Ukraine has diminished dramatically. There are practically no Russian institutions on the Ukrainian soil, at least formally, except one, the church. And I should say that the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine has become closer to Russia than it used to be, even before the war. It's quite strange. It's quite a strange tendency, but I can assure that that is the case. I worked in Ukraine before the Maidan, but came here immediately after the Orange Revolution. And after the Orange Revolution, the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate tried to distance itself from Moscow, tried to prove that it is really a Ukrainian church, which understands the interests and the aspirations of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian society. And it became de facto, effectively, really independent, adopted Ukrainian, discourses. And this was under Metropolitan Volodymyr, who passed away in 2014. And the new leadership of the Ukrainian Church, it seems, did not continue this line, and instead, probably because people who re-emerged to the leadership collaborated with the regime of Yanukovych very closely, and they continued somehow to function in the line of the successors of the Party of Regions, and continue the political interests, to continue supporting political interests of this political force, and affiliated themselves even closer and quite obviously, quite apparently, with the Russian interests. Sometimes they function as representing those interests. For Russia, for the Kremlin, it is important, of course, because given the lack of other institutions or outposts of the Russian politics on the Ukrainian soil, the church is one of those scarce resources that the Kremlin uses, and unfortunately the church does not contribute to that. Does contribute to that. The church does not distance itself from the interests of the Kremlin, and does not help the Ukrainian society to develop a different view about the church as sort of outpost of of Russia.
But you're saying this is because it affiliated itself with political figures from the Party of Regions.
Yes.
Basically adapted its behavior to the behavior of this political...
Exactly. A faction within the Party of Regions.
Why is that? Why are they doing this?
It's a good question. I think I cannot give an answer to this.
Does it have any relation to the financial structure of the church?
I think yes, it can be an explanation, probably, yes. I'm not sure, I don't know exactly. I didn't see it happening, but one can assume that it has to do with different forms of support of the leadership of the church from the figures in the Party of Region. And well, very obvious is the deep involvement of one of the prominent members of the Party of Region, Vadim Novinsky, who is a member of the Ukrainian Parliament, and he is one of the most influential figures in this faction, in this political power force, who is very deeply involved in the matters of the church. He advocates essentially the interests of this church, and he, I think, manages, influences the interests of this church. Which raises a very big issue about the influence of oligarchy upon the church. It's a big issue in the Ukrainian society, the role of the oligarchy, and most Ukrainians detest, they reject the idea that oligarchs should influence politics, while politics should be representing the interests of people. From the perspective of many Ukrainians, probably it is so, the Ukrainian politics is influenced by the interests of a few people of those oligarchs. And unfortunately, this applies not only to the Ukrainian society, but to the church. Moreover, it applies more to the church than to the society. And this strange, seemingly unlogical affiliation between the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate or its leadership. I'd like to emphasize that we are talking about the leadership, not about the church as such. It's a mistake to generalize those judgments and evaluations. But the leadership of the church is very closely affiliated with a particular person, a particular group within the Party of Regions, with this oligarchy group that uses, I believe, this church for its own political ends. We are now entering a new political cycle, electoral cycle. New elections will happen within 1 year, presidential and parliamentary elections, and I think the Party of Regions, the former Party of Regions, what is now called the opposition bloc, wants revenge, wants kind of coming back to the Ukrainian politics, and they will use church as a vehicle of this coming back. So that is the interest of those oligarchs, and they unfortunately influence the leadership, and the church yields to those interests and plays on their side, which coincides to be also the side of the Kremlin. I want to emphasize again, and it is, I believe, important, that there is a huge difference, huge gap between the interests of some leaders of the Ukrainian Church and the majority of the faithful of this church. The leaders, some leaders, they seem to play on the side of the political figures that I've mentioned. They lead the church towards confrontation with the Ukrainian society and with the Ukrainian people unnecessarily. This confrontation is not unnecessary. It's not necessarily. It's not something that the church naturally would support. I don't see any clash, any reason for clash between the Ukrainian church and the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian people. However, the Party of Region, in order to get political support in the next electoral cycle, it needs this clash, it needs this confrontation, because it can come back to power only riding on this confrontation, and it enhances this confrontation. Right. And this exactly is also the purpose of the Kremlin. The Kremlin is interested to divide the Ukrainian society, to increase, to enhance this confrontation. And hence is all this rhetoric about persecutions. Sometimes in Europe people hear words and statements from the Ukrainian church, and they cohere with the statements coming from the Party of Regents and from the Kremlin about the persecutions of the Orthodox in Ukraine, which are false statements. Usually, they contribute to this rhetoric to this policy of confrontation. They help facilitate those statements, the policies of the Kremlin, but they don't reflect the real situation, because there are no persecutions. The only thing that happens is that all religious groups in Ukraine, the state and the Ukrainian society try to treat all the groups in the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian religions equally. That every group should be equal in front of the law. That all communities, they need to decide for themselves. From the perspective of the Ukrainian church, or the leaders of the Ukrainian church that try to also facilitate the political parties or political figures that support them, they present this normalization, I would say, of religious life in the Ukrainian society without favoritism, without favorites, without preferred jurisdictions, the jurisdictions without preferences, which the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate enjoyed under some presidents, like especially under Yanukovych, because it was a privileged church. And what the Ukrainian society tries to do is to deprive some churches of their privileges. And to make them equal, to give all the religious groups equal rights. And exactly these attempts are interpreted by some speakers and some political figures as persecutions against the church.
Okay, so when you're talking about Party of Regents, you mean the opposition bloc, right?
Well, I prefer to use the true name, Party of Regents. Yes, of course, I mean the opposition bloc.
Okay, thank you so much. So, what do the other churches think about Ukrainian autocephaly? What's the political situation like there?
Right. Obviously, for the non-recognized churches, this is a chance to be recognized.
No, but I mean like international, the other autocephalous churches.
Okay, right.
How does that impact the Constantinople Patriarch's decision for this Thomas? Are there any arguments going on?
Right. Now it's still difficult to say what will be the statements from other churches. The global orthodoxy became a global battlefield now of church diplomacies, in some sense. So that the Moscow sends its representatives to different churches to persuade them not to support this movement towards normalization of the church life in Ukraine. And at the same time, the Ukrainian state tries to use also diplomatic means and ecclesial means to persuade other churches to support the Ukrainian cause. Who will win, we will see. Unfortunately, the issue of recognition from other churches became politicized. It has become political, and many political factors play its role. Like, for instance, the pressure upon the ecumenical patriarchate from the Turkish government of Recep Erdogan, for instance. Also, governments in the countries, in other Orthodox countries, will play some role, and those governments will be motivated or demotivated economically and politically by the Kremlin, for instance, obviously. So unfortunately, politics will play an important role in the process of recognition of this autocephaly by other churches. What will be certainly needed is, even though the ecumenical patriarchate, it seems, will take a decision unilaterally, it will be its decision, its own decision. It will also pursue or at least it will launch the process of recognition of this step of this Ukrainian autocephaly by other churches. And politics will play an important role in this process, unfortunately.
So, and regarding internal Ukrainian political issues, how much do you think this is just like a PR move for Poroshenko for his presidential campaign?
Certainly it will contribute to his campaign for re-election, and it has become a part of this campaign already. It's probably not a coincidence that Poroshenko initiated this step in this period when the campaign has begun already. I should say that the initiatives to change something in the situation, to tackle the issue of the ecclesial issue in Ukraine after the Maidan, began immediately after the Maidan. There were ideas, initiatives and pressures from the churches upon Poroshenko and upon the political forces in Ukraine to offer a solution to this ecclesial-political issue, what has become an ecclesial-political issue in the war of Russia against Ukraine. And I should say that Poroshenko, for most of its time, for most of its tenure as a president, until recently, impeded any solution, giving any solution to this issue. He did not promote it. He did not help it to be solved, and it began this only. It supported this issue. It came up with it. He came up with this initiative only recently. I think yes. His rationale is obviously complex. It may be personal. As I said, he is a faithful member of the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, at least used to be. This motivation can be also kind of political in the sense he understands that this issue needs to be given a political solution because it contributes to the war. But it's also political in the sense that it may contribute to his re-election campaign. And if he manages, if this solution will be given by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, if there will be success, this will give him a very strong chance to be re-elected for the second term. If he fails, because this initiative is so closely now associated with his name, if this initiative fails, I think his chances to be re-elected will decrease dramatically.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Anything maybe we forgot? Anything you want to add?
Yes, probably I should say that I believe that the issue of autocephaly for the Ukrainian Church, the model as it is being considered nowadays, is a model of plurality within the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. 10 years ago, in 2008, the model which was promoted by President Yushchenko was a model of one single church, which would comprise all the Orthodox under its umbrella. That church would be easily managed by the state. Obviously, the connection and dependence of the church upon the state would be strong. Would have been strong. Nowadays, we are talking about a completely different model. It's a model of one of several jurisdictions, recognized jurisdictions in Ukraine, meaning that there will be no monopoly upon the Orthodox from any church structure, and there will be no monopoly from the state, of the state upon any church. It will contribute to diversity within the Ukrainian Orthodoxy, and this diversity will be legit, it will be legitimate, it will be canonical. I think it will contribute also to the change of mentality regarding religious issues, because the idea of one single church even though it is normal for the Orthodox world, but it also creates this idea of I would say it doesn't help the idea of kind of plural thinking. While if Orthodox accept the idea that there can be several canonical churches, Orthodox churches in one state, they will appreciate easier other religious diversity in the country, because the Ukrainian society, Ukrainian nation is religiously diverse. It is very religious. It's not secular. And when it comes to religions, those religions are not singular. They are diverse. There are many Protestants. There are many Catholics of different sorts in Ukraine. There are Muslims, Jews, and I think Ukrainians learned to appreciate this diversity, religious diversity, especially in the Maidan. And granting autocephaly to the Ukrainian Church will contribute to the same idea of appreciating diversity of this religious landscape in Ukraine.
So you're saying UOC MP is not going anywhere after
No,
this?
it will stay. It will certainly stay.
Okay.
Yes, it will stay, and it's good that it will stay. I believe because it will contribute to this diversity.
I see, but isn't that in conflict with Orthodox ecclesiastical norms?
No,
that
I
there
don't think
can't
so.
be two.
I studied this issue.
Yeah.
I studied this issue in my books on ecclesiology, and I came to the conclusion that this is not a norm. That is not the only norm that can exist in the Orthodox Church, that one state should have one church.
Can you please name this norm, because I couldn't find
Yes,
the exact words?
yes, there is no a name for that norm,
Okay.
but essentially it is expressed in a formula that one country or one city should have one church.
Okay.
This norm is a late norm. It appeared in the in the beginning of the Middle Ages somehow. It's not an apostolic, it's not the original norm, and the original structure of the Orthodox Church allowed several jurisdictions to exist in one place, something that we see in diaspora in the United States, for instance, or in Europe. So it's not abnormal. It's one of existent norms. It's not, well...
No, but doesn't that lead to some negative consequences in the US when churches turn into national ghettos, for instance?
Well, not necessarily. Well, I've been to many jurisdictions in the US, which came to the US as national ghettos, and they are not anymore. They are pretty much American, all of them, most of them.
That's because the diaspora Americanized.
Well, yes, but it's a natural process, and I don't see any major problems. I would put it in this way: in Ukraine, the existing situation, the situation of one recognized church and several unrecognized churches, which are in conflict with one another, which cause traumas of legitimacy upon many, inflict this trauma of legitimacy upon millions of people. It's much worse than the problems that will emerge from the situation of jurisdictional plurality. If we could have one single canonical church for Ukraine, it would be ideal, probably. I believe it would have bad implications, but it's a different question. My point is that the situation that we long for of plurality of jurisdictions in Ukraine is not abnormal. It's one of the norms of Christianity, one of the forgotten norms, I would say, of Christianity, and I hope it will solve a lot of problems. It will cause its own problems, but I hope that those problems will be less severe than the problems that we face nowadays.
Sounds very optimistic. Yeah.
Well, I am quite optimistic.
Yeah. Okay.
But try to be realistic about the upcoming problems.
So we're finishing with all of our questions here, just maybe on the sidelines. So we talked about the sort of oligarchs influencing USCMP.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to assume that there is the same kind of oligarchs influencing UOCKP?
Right. Well, nowadays I cannot say that there are oligarchs who influence other jurisdictions, other churches.
Where do they get the money then?
I don't know. You should ask them. But what I see is that the oligarchs exploit the differences, this difference between canonical and non-canonical status of the churches to their own interests. They actually, what they do, I mean particular oligarchs, they divide and rule the church. They exploit the divisions. They exploit these differentiation. That's why they go. I mean particularly this oligarch Vadim Novinsky. They go together with other church hierarchs to other churches and persuades those churches not to recognize autocephaly for the Ukrainian church, because that is the precondition for them to use politically this division between the churches, to use the unique status, canonical status of the Moscow Patriarchate. That's why I believe if a part of the Ukrainian church will be granted autocephaly, it will weaken, it will diminish options for those oligarchs to exploit the church for their own political ends.
Well, let's hope that everything works, that Ukraine will get its...
No hope. Something will not work. Let us hope that something will work.
Let's hope that something